My name is Adam. I'm 34 years old. I live in Spokane, Washington, and I want to share something that happened to my family and has haunted me since childhood. I'm not the type to believe in paranormal things, and to this day I try to find a logical explanation for what happened, but honestly, I never could. This story began when I was about 10 years old, and as far as I know, it still happens. In my family, Christmas was always the most important time of the year. My parents made a point of decorating the entire house with lights, wreaths, and of course a huge Christmas tree in the living room. We lived in an old house from the early 20th century with that Victorian style that looked straight out of a postcard. The living room had a huge mirror on the wall next to the fireplace, one of those antique mirrors with a heavy dark wood frame, very ornate. I always found that mirror a bit intimidating, but for my parents, it was just another charming detail of the house. What happened for the first time that year changed everything. On Christmas morning, as usual, we woke up excited to open presents. My younger sisters, Claire and Emily, ran to the living room before me. When I got there, I noticed there was a package no one had noticed before, wrapped in red paper with a perfect gold ribbon. It was small but stood out, especially because none of us remembered putting that present there. My parents thought maybe it was from a neighbor or something like that, but there was no tag, no name, just a small inscription in the corner of the package. For you. My mom ended up opening it, more out of curiosity than anything else. Inside was a small glass figurine in the shape of an angel. It was beautiful, but something about it unsettled me. The angel's eyes, though just etched details in the glass, seemed eerily realistic, as if they were looking directly at you. My mom thought it was lovely and placed the angel on the shelf in front of the mirror, not giving it much thought. That's when things started to get strange. That same day, while we were all in the kitchen preparing lunch, Claire came running to call us, saying the angel was no longer on the shelf. We thought she must have moved it and forgotten where she put it, but when we went back to the living room, there it was in another corner, right next to the mirror. My mom was a bit annoyed, thinking one of us was playing a prank, but no one admitted to touching the angel. Over the next few days, the same thing happened repeatedly. Every time we left the living room and came back, the angel had moved, but it always reappeared near a mirror, whether it was the big one in the living room, the one in the hallway, or even the small one in the bathroom. I even started doing some tests. Once, I hid the figurine in a drawer in my room, far from any mirrors. When I came back a few minutes later, it was gone. I went downstairs to the living room, and there it was again, near the big mirror. No one had passed me or gone upstairs. The situation got even stranger the following year. We thought the angel was just a bizarre coincidence, but on Christmas morning, there was another unexpected gift. The same red paper, the same gold ribbon, and again, no sender. This time, it was an antique pocket watch with a small mirror on its lid. My mom thought it was a coincidence and placed the watch next to the angel near the big mirror, but the watch also started appearing in different places, always near mirrors. The pattern was the same. Over the years, this became almost a bizarre tradition. Every Christmas, a new gift appeared, always something that seemed deliberately chosen to match the house. One year, it was a music box with a mirrored lid. Another year, a necklace with a pendant that shone like polished glass. And all these objects had the strange habit of moving around the house, always reappearing near a mirror. One Christmas, things got truly frightening. I was about 16 years old, and by then I was completely uncomfortable with all of it. My parents, on the other hand, tried to ignore it, as if it was something trivial. That year, the gift was a small oval mirror in a decorative frame. When my mom hung it on the wall, I started to notice something I hadn't before. Whenever I passed by any of these mirrors, it felt like something was watching me. It wasn't just paranoia. The feeling was real. I avoided looking directly into the mirrors in the house, but sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something move. That same year, something happened that left a deep mark on me. It was late at night, and I had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water. When I returned to the hallway, I noticed the small framed mirror was on the floor, as if someone had taken it off the wall. When I bent down to pick it up, I saw something in the reflection. It was quick, like a dark shadow, but with a shape I couldn't quite identify. I immediately backed away, dropping the mirror again. My dad heard the noise and came to see what was going on. When I explained, he just gave me that look that said, "You're imagining things." After I moved out, I still visited my parents for Christmas, but that macabre tradition continued. Every year, a new gift. They still keep all the objects and display them together on a shelf in the living room, as if it were a collection. I've tried to convince my mom to get rid of them, but she always laughs it off and says it's just in my head. To this day, when I think about it, I get chills. I never managed to figure out where these gifts come from or why they keep appearing. I've searched forums, looked online, and even asked people I know, but I've never found anyone who's experienced anything similar. The strangest part is that after I left the house, none of this happened to me again. It seems like this is somehow tied to the house, or maybe to the mirrors. Now, when I visit my parents at Christmas, I avoid looking at the shelf where they keep the presents. I also try not to spend too much time in the living room, especially near that big mirror. I don't know what it is, but I feel like there's something there, something watching us when we're not looking back. And to this day, no one in my family remembers ever putting any of those gifts under the tree. My name is David. I'm 38 years old, and I live in a small town in Maine called Ashford Hollow. I'm here to share an experience I had 5 years ago that still gives me chills every time I think about it. I always thought those strange things people talk about online or see in movies were just made up, but what happened to me was so real that I can't explain it. Ashford Hollow is a tiny town with around 300 residents, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and life is very simple. There's not much to do, but it's perfect for someone who enjoys a quiet routine. The town square is where everyone gathers, especially on weekends, to chat or shop at the local market. It has a wooden gazebo that was placed there decades ago and a giant Christmas tree decorated with lights every December. It's a beautiful spot, but deep down, I've always felt a bit uneasy whenever I passed by at night. It felt like something was always watching, something I couldn't see but knew was there, waiting. It all started on the first night of December, the evening that marked the opening of the Christmas season. I was out on my porch, smoking my last cigarette before bed, as I usually did to unwind. It was freezing, the kind of biting cold only a Maine winter can bring. That's when I heard something in the distance, a sound I initially thought was just the wind. But it wasn't. It was like a soft singing, a choir, but with a melody so unusual, almost otherworldly. The voices were clear and precise, harmonious like a group of angels. I stood there, frozen, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the square, but there shouldn't have been anyone there at that hour. I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the sound continued, growing stronger as the night went on. It was as if the voices were everywhere around me, yet I couldn't see a single soul. It wasn't a distant sound, it was close, almost intimate. That night I decided to leave it alone, but I couldn't sleep. That melody kept echoing in my head, a tune that felt familiar, yet completely unknown. The next day I spoke to my neighbour, Mrs. Jenkins, a woman in her 70s who had lived in Ashford Hollow her whole life. Casually she asked me, "Did you hear the singing last night?" I asked her what she thought it was, and she gave me a serious look before saying, "It's the Christmas songs. We always hear them around here, but no one knows where they come from." At first, I didn't take her seriously and dismissed it as some old town tale. But as the days went by, I started hearing more and more about it. When I asked other residents, they all shared similar stories. They always heard the singing, but could never find its source. That night, my curiosity got the better of me. I wasn't content just hearing about it from others. I wanted to see for myself. So I stayed up late. Around 10 p.m, the voices began again. It was like an invisible orchestra playing far off, yet the sound was crystal clear. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and headed to the square, determined to find out where it was coming from. The square was deserted as expected. The gazebo stood there, the Christmas tree lights twinkling softly, but there was no one around. The voices continued, but as I looked around, the square was empty, lifeless. The lights in the nearby houses were off, and the sound seemed to rise from the ground, from the heart of the square. I stood there for minutes trying to make sense of it. The sound was everywhere, yet there was nothing to see. Just as I was starting to feel uneasy, the voices abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the sound itself. I went back home, still trying to process everything. I kept wondering if I was losing my mind or if there was some logical explanation for it. But as the month went on, the singing continued. It always began around 10 p.m. and stopped when the house lights turned off. No matter how hard we tried, we couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I started asking other residents if they heard it, and they all confirmed it. They were so used to it that it seemed normal to them, but to me, it was terrifying. One night I invited my friend Paul over. He lived on a farm a bit outside of town and never believed in anything remotely strange. He would always laugh at me when I talked about the oddities of Ashford Hollow. When he arrived, I was nervous. I knew he wouldn't believe me, but I insisted he stay. As night fell, the voices started again. Paul fell silent as he listened to the songs, which seemed to echo inside our heads. He looked at me, wide-eyed, and the next morning, he left without saying a word. Since that day, he's never answered my calls and has never returned to Ashford Hollow. Things took an even stranger turn on Christmas Eve. As usual, the town held a celebration in the square with a children's choir and some performances. While everyone was gathered, celebrating, the voices began again, but this time they were louder and more intense. It wasn't just a soft, pleasant sound anymore. It was something that filled the entire space, a presence you could feel in every breath. While the children were singing on stage, the invisible choir drowned them out, and no one could understand what was happening. Some people started praying, others ran back to their homes. The event ended in minutes, and the square emptied faster than I'd ever seen. After that night, the voices stopped altogether. December came and went, and as if by some miracle, nothing happened again. Life in the town went back to normal, but for me, it never felt the same. Every time I pass by the square, especially at night, I get a chill down my spine. It feels like something is still there, watching, but I don't know what. I don't know if it was spirits or if there's some logical explanation for what happened. All I know is that to this day, nothing has erased that sound from my memories. I don't know what happened that night or why the voices disappeared, but something tells me that if I keep looking, I'll end up finding something I might not want to know. To this day, no one in the town talks about it anymore. It's like a blanket of silence has covered everything, as if, for some reason, everyone wants to forget. I've never heard the singing again, but I can't stop wondering what really happened there. If anyone knows of anything similar, please let me know. My name is Mark. I'm 37 years old and I live in Vermont. What I'm about to share happened exactly 7 years ago on Christmas Eve. It's something that still gives me chills every time I think about it, and honestly, I can't explain what happened that night. Back then, my wife Rachel and I were living in an old house we had bought for a good price, deep in the countryside. It was a quiet place surrounded by forests, which seemed perfect for starting our life together. The house had that farmhouse charm, with a slanted roof and a cozy porch. The only thing that bothered me was that everything about it seemed strange. Not scary, just a feeling that things there were older than they appeared. That year, my sister Laura and her husband Tim decided to spend Christmas with us. They brought my nephew Ben, who was 6 years old and excited about the lights and presents. We spent the entire day preparing the Christmas dinner and decorating the house with everything we had: wreaths, twinkling lights, candles. Despite the cold outside, the house felt warm and festive, until that night. It was around 11 p.m. when we sat in the living room to play cards and drink hot chocolate. Ben had already gone to sleep in the guest room upstairs, and the rest of us were laughing and chatting. That's when I heard it for the first time. It was a subtle sound, like the distant tinkling of bells. I thought it might be the wind or maybe one of the decorations on the porch, but I didn't pay much attention to it. A few minutes later, Rachel stopped talking mid-sentence. She frowned and asked, "Did you hear that too?" Tim replied that it sounded like bells, but somehow heavier. That caught my attention because the sound no longer seemed so distant. It sounded like it was coming from above. Laura joked, saying it might be reindeer on the roof, and we laughed. But something in her tone suggested she was also a bit uneasy. I went to the window, expecting to see something, maybe a shadow on the roof. There was nothing. The snow in the yard was untouched, and the sky was clear enough for me to see everything around the house. Even so, the sound persisted. It was a metallic, rhythmic sound, like large bells being rung slowly. And before I knew it, I was just standing there, listening for far too long. The sound started to get louder. Tim suggested that maybe some animal had climbed onto the roof, but it didn't make sense. There was no way such a distinct, rhythmic sound could come from something like that. We decided to check the attic, which was right above the living room, but when we opened the small access door, the sound stopped. Absolute silence. There was nothing there except boxes and dust. We went back to the living room and tried to continue playing, but the tension was palpable. About half an hour later, the bells started again. Only this time it was different. They were louder and seemed to be coming from inside the house. Rachel grabbed my arm and whispered that it sounded like it was coming from the walls. I have to admit, my stomach turned cold. We walked around the house, trying to locate the source of the sound. We went to the hallway, then the kitchen, but it seemed to move. The strangest thing was that the sound had no echo, no reverberation, as you'd expect in a closed space. It was as if it was trapped within the walls, in a place we couldn't reach. Ben started crying upstairs, and Laura ran up to comfort him. When she came back down, she was pale. She said the sound was louder in his room. By this point, no one was pretending this was normal anymore. Rachel wanted to leave the house, but it was almost midnight, and it was snowing heavily outside. Besides, the sound had stopped again. That's when we noticed another strange detail. The house felt colder than before. Not like the heater had turned off, but a chill that seemed to seep out of the walls, as if the place itself was wrong. Somehow, we made it through the night. No one really slept. We stayed in the living room, huddled under blankets, while the bells came and went, always seeming to move to a different place. By morning, the sound had stopped, but when we got up, something new had taken its place. A smell. It was hard to describe. It wasn't rotten, nor sweet. It was something I had never smelled before, but that was completely unpleasant. It seemed to be embedded in the entire house, as if it was in the very air. We opened all the windows, but the smell wouldn't go away. Tim even went to the basement, thinking maybe some animal had died there, but he found nothing. We spent the day out trying to distract ourselves, but when we came back that evening, the smell was still there. Not as strong as in the morning, but still present, like a reminder that something had happened. After that Christmas, Rachel and I decided to move. We didn't sell the house right away, but we never spent another night there. To this day, I don't know what happened on that Christmas Eve. I've never found any logical explanation, and honestly, I'd rather not look for one. I've read similar accounts online, but never anything exactly like this. Sometimes when I tell this story, people think I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. And if you ask me, I think it was something that doesn't belong to this world. Whatever it was, I just hope it never finds another place to ring its bells. My name is Michael. I'm 34 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, and this story happened to me when I was 10. To this day, I still can't fully explain what I saw, and to be honest, I'd rather not think about it too much. But with Christmas approaching, these memories always come back, and maybe sharing this will help me put an end to it, or at least get it out of my head for a while. It was December 1999, and I still remember how excited we were that year. My mom loved Christmas and made a point of filling the house with decorations. The tree was always in the living room, next to a big window overlooking the backyard. Since I was the youngest, my job was to help with the string lights and place the star on top. After we finished decorating, we would sit on the couch, just admiring the brightly lit room. My mom used to say that Christmas was magical. But what happened that year? Well, it wasn't magical at all. It was something else. Something that still gives me chills just thinking about it. The first time it happened was on the night of December 3rd. I woke up suddenly with no apparent reason and looked at the digital clock beside my bed. It was 2 a.m. sharp. My window faced the street, and the street lamp cast shadows that danced on the ceiling of my room. But that night was strangely silent, as if the entire world had stopped. I got up to go to the bathroom, and as I passed through the living room, something caught my attention. The lights on the Christmas tree were still on, which was odd because my mom always turned them off before bed. That's when I saw it. On the other side of the room, next to the tree, stood the shadow of a man. He was just standing there, as if admiring the tree, but it was impossible to see much detail. He seemed to be wearing something like a long coat and a hat, but that was all I could make out. I froze in place, my heart pounding. I tried to say something, but no sound came out. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to turn on the light, and in that instant he vanished. But the tree's reflection in the window never showed his shadow. That made it even scarier. I ran back to my room, but couldn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I told my mom what had happened, but she just laughed and said, I must have been dreaming. My dad didn't even bother to listen. That was always the way it was. They never took anything I said seriously. But I knew it wasn't a dream. It was real. In the following days, it happened again. Every night, exactly at 2 a.m., I would wake up and feel a sort of heaviness in the air, as if something was wrong. I didn't even want to leave my room, but I always ended up going to the living room. And there he was, standing in the same spot, next to the tree. It didn't matter if I tried to watch from a distance or got a little closer. He never moved. It was as if he were fixed in that spot, completely motionless. And every time it was the same thing. He would disappear as soon as I turned on the light, and the reflection in the window never showed anything but the tree. After a week, I started feeling paranoid. I tried staying awake all night to see if I could figure out what was happening, but I'd always end up falling asleep and waking up at exactly 2 a.m. It was like something was forcing me to wake up at that time. One night, I mustered the courage to grab a flashlight to try and see better without turning on the room lights. When I shone the light in his direction, he was still there. But somehow, the flashlight didn't seem to affect him. It was as if the light simply passed through him without touching the figure. I knew I needed proof, so I grabbed a disposable camera my mom had bought for us to use at Christmas. I waited until 2 a.m., and when he appeared again, I snapped a few pictures. My heart was racing as I pressed the button. The next day, I took the film to be developed at a nearby pharmacy without telling anyone. When the photos were ready, I felt a chill run down my spine. The living room was there, the tree was there, but the shadow, it wasn't in any of the pictures. It was as if he had never been there. I became obsessed with it. I searched the internet for similar stories, but all I could find were urban legends and vague accounts that didn't quite match what I was experiencing. I thought about talking to a neighbor, but what would I even say? That there was a shadow man in my living room every night? They'd think I was making it up, or worse, losing my mind. On Christmas Eve, my mom decided we'd leave the tree lights on all night to keep the Christmas spirit alive. I didn't say anything, but I was terrified. I was already used to him showing up, but that night I had a bad feeling, like something was different. At 2 a.m. I woke up again, but this time I felt something strange in my room. It was as if the air was heavier, colder. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, the living room looked normal. The tree was there, glowing with its colourful lights, but he wasn't in his usual corner. My relief was short-lived because when I turned to look at the window, he was outside. Not in the shadow, but on the window itself, as if he were watching me. I screamed, but no one woke up. When I turned to switch on the light, he disappeared again. That time, I stayed awake until sunrise, too afraid to go back to bed. After that, he never appeared again. The rest of the month passed without incident, and I tried to move on, but it stayed with me. Even now, more than 20 years later, every time I see a Christmas tree at night, I get the same shiver down my spine.